Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm absolutely delighted to invite you to our next Rebellious Research Seminar Series. And today I'm very, very pleased to have a very special guest from far, far away from where I am based, Mark Schleser. And Mark will be talking about the future is more about the talk which is titled "The Future Is Now: Mobile Filmmaking and Smart Storytelling as Rebellious and Creative Practice Research." So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and the next hour or so is yours, Max, and then we're gonna take some questions. Thank you.
Let me just do the share screen magic. I think that's coming through.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Reset this. So yeah, thanks very much for having me. Good morning. It's really great to be here. The Rebellious Research resource is like shared with all my PhD students. And I've been really enjoying, some of the talks. So very, very stoked to be part of this as well. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Today I'll talk about storytelling and smartphone filmmaking, and I think it's very important to remember that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the original storytellers of this place, and I would like to recognize their significant contributions to the contemporary moving image, film, and television. So when I get started to think about this talk, I was like, so many great things to talk about. And you think that you've got almost like an hour, which seems long, but then it's actually not, because I think it's a really nice idea for me to be a good creative arts researcher, maybe reflect a bit back. So I didn't want to just talk about one project that I did, but maybe think about a common thread that I can see in my practice. And then also talk a bit about one of the things that I find quite important in not only studying a field, but shaping a particular field of mobile phone filmmaking, but also smartphone filmmaking. And I would also like to highlight some of the things that I learned in producing mobile phone films and smartphone films at the time when they were very much emerging media or new media or something that we hadn't sort of thought through to the full extent, how this can be very much applied, some of these methods towards what happened now with cinematic VR, or like also this very contemporary time with like generative AI. And so just thinking a bit about what it means to be what being rebellious research means. So because Agatha, like your book, I think I quite like the outline in the ground rules, as you call it, I think. So be rebellious. So I quite like the quote, "There are no methods or methodologies to support your idea, invent new ones." And that resonates very well for me, because when I started making mobile phone films, you could type into Google mobile phone filmmaking, nothing would come up. So great for a researcher, which of course then causes some other problems. How do you contextualize it? And so that's where I think the historical approach can be quite interesting for emerging media forms. You also give us a great prompt. Are you going against the established way of doing things? And so I think that is sometimes when you work with very emerging or new or original forms, something that I think we almost have to take up as a creative challenge. But I think we are very much in the business of creating new knowledge and making original contributions. So I think, if it's sometimes about finding what you would call find allies, find the right allies to where your work resonates. And that's something that I would like to talk about with networking. And I think networking is quite important, but I think we haven't really thought through how this works as a method. So I would try to test out some ideas today in this talk to see how it works. And then of course, I think your prompt, embed robust reflective practice in your work and evaluate the direction on a regular basis, which was sort of the idea when I said, okay, this is a great provocation, but let me not just talk about one project, but let me think about what happened in the last years of my practice. And so I think my main rebellious act is to use films or use certain technologies in a way that they haven't been invented. And I would like to talk about very much my NTROs, non-traditional research outputs, or in some countries it's called research creation or research activities. And I think you will definitely see that I'm quite inspired by Kinoki Filmmaking and Giga Vertov, who termed this work as an experiment in cinematic communication. And that's, I think, is a good way to start. And for me, it's really like, if I have to sum it up, the overall approach is to think about an aesthetic exploration and refinement using storytelling as the interface between technology and culture, or rather cultural production. And yeah, so, I had to pick some of my rebellious acts when I decided to think which film should I talk about. So in the last years, I think one of the first films that was went to a festival. So I've made around 20 short films. 15 of them are mobile and smartphone films. Created 2 feature films, 4 cinematic VR projects, and 3 transmedia productions. And so I selected a few that I think I would say have the biggest rebellic merit, so to say. Overall, I have to think I could be situated in the field of experimental documentary for sure. I quite like the city genre, the city films. But lots of my work is also engaged in very much community engaged practices. Now I also work with visual methodologies for interdisciplinary research. And for me, it's about creative innovation. But I think social connection is a key element of storytelling and the way that we connect. I'm particularly interested in these moments before a certain discourse was shaped around a certain understanding or tool or technology. So for instance, when we think about documentary, we all know, the definition was 1926. But of course, there were documentaries before it was defined as a creative treatment of actuality. And so I think these are always some very interesting windows of time that open up to really understand what was happening. So, I started to make mobile phone films and uploaded my first mobile phone video to YouTube in 2006. Then, like in 2016, I was very much working with 360 video cameras. So when you think about the Samsung Gear 360, which was sort of rather marketed as a webcam than for video conferencing, then as a filmmaking device, and then a few years later, it was a sort of explosion of 360 video cameras, and all the festivals had the cinematic VR category and still have it. And then just very recently, I've been quite excited to work with a LiDAR camera on your phone. So again, of course, thinking about some of the ideas now, how can we work, for instance, with Gen AI to create some productions? And I think the interesting thing there as well is we've talked a lot about digital filmmaking, and I think we can really now see how this advances in the field of computational filmmaking. But I think I'd also just very much like to mention that lots of my work is really about this idea of knowledge transfer and disseminating my practice into various different communities. And so the communities are very diverse. So this ranges from workshops at festivals. So like on my top left, you can see me there speaking at the Festival de la Imagen. I always normally run a workshop at the St. Kilda Festival, where I've done for quite some years. So in Australia, the longest running short film festival. And of course it's great because we speak to a room full of full of filmmakers. But I think for me it's also quite rebellious, and I quite like the idea that everyone can be a filmmaker. So making projects with young people, so a project, for instance, on the spirit of Rangatahi in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So Rangatahi means youth, and I was very much working with Pacific and Maori youth to help them to tell stories from their perspectives. We made a great project with the Goethe Institute to make films about the environment, and I think it was quite important that everyone can make a contribution. Everyone has a story to tell about the environment, and that's what we really understand how issues like climate change can really resonate with multiple people if there's multiple stories. But also working with senior citizens, for instance, so 60 Plus Online, where we taught storytelling to senior citizens. And so lots of these projects are very much also working in a very collaborative way. I thought I'd kick it off with a short intro about my book, Smartphone Filmmaking, Theory and Practice.
Greetings from Melbourne. I'm recording this video on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Today I will talk about smartphone filmmaking theory and practice, which has been published by Bloomsbury this year. Mobile, smartphone and pocket filmmaking is a global phenomenon with distinctive festivals, filmmakers and creators that are defining an original film form. Smartphone filmmaking theory and practice explores the diverse approaches towards smartphone filmmaking and provides an overview of the international smartphone filmmaking community. The interviews with smartphone filmmakers, entrepreneurs, creative technologists, storytellers, educators, and smartphone film festival directors provide a source of inspiration and insights for professionals, emerging filmmakers, and rookies who would like to join this creative community. While not every story might be appropriate to be realized with a mobile device or smartphone, if working with communities, capturing locations, or working in the domain of personal or first-person filmmaking, the smartphone or mobile device should be considered as camera of choice. The mobile specificity is expressed through accessibility, mobility, and its intimate and immediate qualities. These smartphone filmmaking specific characteristics and personal forms of crafting experiences contribute to the formation of new storytelling approaches. Stylistic developments of vertical video and collaborative processes in smartphone filmmaking are evolving into hybrid formats that resonate in other film forms. This book not only develops a framework for the analysis of smartphone filmmaking, but also reviews the contemporary scholarship and directions within the creative arts and the creative industries. Smartphone filmmaking theory and practice initiates a conversation on the current trends and discusses its impact on adjacent disciplines and recent developments in emerging media and screen production, such as mobile XR, extended reality. Day.
Yeah. And in the book Smartphone Filmmaking Theory and Practice, I really outline the contemporary scene of mobile filmmaking and smartphone filmmaking. And for me, it was very much this argument of developing the idea that there's no more personal stories and there's more authentic, that there's more personal and more authentic stories are surfacing. There's greater access to storytelling. It's part of a community engagement strategy and it's very much a global phenomenon. And the way that I looked at smartphone filmmaking, the ideas of smartphone filmmaking theory and practice was that I've been curating a smartphone film festival in MENA since 2011, and I came across a really interesting book, which is Rethinking Curating, where Graham and Cook point out that an artist might be best placed to curate an emerging medium because they work with it and they know about it. And so they will very much say that new media art is like contemporary art, but it has particular characteristics that distinguish it from the contemporary art, by extension from the systems involved in the production, exhibition, interpretation, and dissemination of contemporary art, which is sort of the realm of the creators. So I think this is very much the relationship that I can see with smartphone filmmaking in the contemporary film industry. So there's some very much similarities, but there's some differences as well. And they have a great quote, which I read out to you as well. It's fundamentally change the notions of authorship. The network model of new media is not a broadcast model of one-to-many, but many-to-many approach to peer-to-peer networking. The role of the artist, audience, and participants are blurring. Participants are sometimes the audience. The audience of peer is excellent for pushing the expertise and a critical level within the field. And so what I try to do in this book is very much to look at what happened at the MENA Smartphone Film Festival, at other smartphone film festivals, but also in this really much emerging creative ecology. And so I did a bit of mapping to look what are the different festivals that sort of emerged. We can sort of very proudly say that MENA is the longest running smartphone film festival in the southern hemisphere. There's one festival in India that's been running also in its 14th or 15th edition now. In 2012, there weren't too many festivals that focused on mobile and smartphone filmmaking. And of course, always very interesting to see how these festivals are situated in a creative and cultural economy. So some festivals, like for instance in the US, are very much a private enterprise. In Europe, there sometimes used to be some good funding available for it, but also in South Korea, for instance, which film festivals are supported because they produce films in Korean language. And so, of course, these sort of things very much shape how smartphone filmmaking operates. And I continued doing a bit of mapping, but then just in 2018, you could sort of see that there's quite a few more festivals that emerged. Some disappeared, but it was really nice to see that you could have so the color coding is very much with blue. At that time, MENA was running for 8 years. The orange festivals have been running for 5 to 7 years, and green then for 2 or 4 years. And just very recently, I looked at the Film Freeway Film Festival submission website, and when you punch in, mobile phone film festival or smartphone film festival, for mobile phone film festival, you get 414 festivals that have some kind of a category of mobile or smartphone filmmaking. For smartphone, there's around 124 festivals. So it's quite substantial in a way. And it spans across major film festivals like the New York Film Festival that has like a category, or festivals, independent festivals that has a category, or these festivals that are focused only on mobile, smartphone and pocket filmmaking. But if you put these numbers into perspective, so if you search for festivals in Australia, you find like 401. Or if you look for festivals in UK, there's 1,100 festivals. So, but then there isn't as much scholarship around mobile and smartphone filmmaking as there is about festivals or Australian filmmaking. So I think it's great to see that there's more and more scholarship emerging now around this. But I think the numbers are really like demonstrating that there is also really like a need to really investigate this, because there's more and more smartphone film festivals appearing. And what I wanted to do with the book, Smartphone Filmmaking Theory and Practice, is really to provide an overview. And of course, there's so many different festivals, there's so many different filmmakers, there's so many different approaches. I don't think that we can combine all of these things into one field. And so in documentary research, I only like to start with some, Bill Nichols modes of documentary. They're quite well known. More recently, the iDocs modes from Aston, Gaudenzi, and Rose, 2017, were also quite successful. And I thought, this is like a great way. I mean, of course, the iDocs as well as Nichols very clearly say that these modes are just a starting point, and they are not like exclusive. And there's crossover between these things, between these different modalities. And so I thought that was a great way to start to have an understanding how we can compare smartphone filmmaking within the realm of smartphone filmmaking, but then also create some subcategories for it. So I developed the different approaches, which are the poetic and experimental mode, the participatory and engagement mode, the smartphone native mode, so films that have been filmed and edited on a mobile device, the conversational mode, and the red carpet in your pocket mode. So the red carpet in your pocket mode is very much for narrative productions. And this then provides an overview of how we can talk about mobile phone films or smartphone films, comparing them to other mobile phone or smartphone films. Because that's what you do with any other type of films or in a particular genre. And so, again, this is not like saying that these films have to fit in these sort of categories, but it's very much a starting point to start initiate a conversation about mobile, smartphone, and pocket filmmaking. The other thing that I think is really exciting for me is to see that in the last years, some documentaries, feature-length documentaries, did very well at festivals. And I was lucky enough to be on a study tour at the 69th and 70s Berlinale and get to see the premiere of these films in the cinema. And also, Berlinale is great because you can, ask the filmmaker a question or just walk up to them after the screening and have a discussion with them. And some of these films could not have been produced with a traditional broadcast camera, very much because they work with the affordances of the mobile phone, such as selfie, which is very much filmed in the selfie mode. And when you see the film in the cinema, it looks a bit more like a YouTube feed or like a Facebook feed rather. But after some time, you sort of think that you know the two main characters of the film, Pietro and Alessandro, very well. It's also a very moving film about the Hassan family, Midnight Traveler, about their refugee journey from Afghanistan to Europe. And a similar film from Saudi Runaway, from Swiss-German filmmaker Susanne Regina Moiris, who has been very successful with her film Saudi Runaway, which was a distribution deal with National Geographic. She has made some more films, Girl Gang, that are now on Netflix, which also were produced with smartphones. And so I think that is very much shaping new forms of storytelling through the affordances of mobile devices. And so for us as creative arts researchers, I think it's like a really interesting time because the media landscape is changing. And I think this change of development is becoming more and more rapid. And so we've been ticking through these developments of, there's maybe a bit of enthusiasm about Web 2.0, but then we realized that it's actually a new centralization of the web. And then of course now we've got like Web 3 with decentralization, but also the semantic web. The, other people talk about the, big industrial 4.0 revolution. So, we can also maybe push on the creative arts towards, creative arts 4.0 that, starts to embrace collaboration with data. If you think about smart contracts. So, but I don't think that any of these production approaches will replace traditional production approaches. It will just open up new opportunities. And it will provide different pathways of how to tell stories and how to engage audiences. And at MENA, at the Smartphone Film Festival, the idea was that, when we started in 2011, we didn't want to have as many confinements or restraints really. The festival launched in New Zealand, Aotearoa, in the Film Archive, and they were really great to work with, Natanga Sound and Vision, and I could program for a whole week, but it was a bit too much, so we sort of decided now to, or I decided now to change it to like a, a 3-hour screening block that provides a better way to engage audiences in a cinema experience. But it was for always us to be like really at the trend and at the pulse of the time and see what are these new developments. So we started to have drone filmmaking in 2017, and we had like cinematic VR productions in 2018, and then last year we got some emails from some filmmakers. They were like, "Oh, in your creative category, can we have like mobile AI?" We were like, "Yes, of course." And so I say we because I'm the sort of film festival director, so to say. But of course, I work with lots of with lots of judges, and there's always a bit of a committee that works with it. And so, thinking about mobile creative arts practice, I started to do some publications that very much start to point at the specificity of doing creative practice research with mobile devices or smartphones. There's an edited collection coming forward, it's a special issue in the journal Media Practice Education coming forward, so watch this space. But I think when I started this talk, I thought about like this reflective moment, and going back from the Mobile Studies Congress in 2013, which was in Zhejiang, in Hangzhou, Zhejiang University in Hangzhou, I was at the train station and was traveling back with 2 colleagues, and we had a really great conversation about how we work, how we methodologically approach storytelling, how we think about our practice. And so it was really nice to have a conversation as a smartphone filmmaker with Florian Thalhofer, who's on the way to Berlin. He's an interactive filmmaker, of course he's the inventor of Korsakov, with Dr. Shuai Li, who's on his way back to Harbin, China, who's a TikTok filmmaker. And so we discussed a lot what our original methods are, and I think that was also like a nice provocation for me that I thought back that I can finally like provide this answer to my colleagues, or something that I would like to explore in the presentation today. But maybe before I start talking about what I think my methods are, I sort of thought, when you do all these grant applications, it's always good to see what other people say about you. And it was really nice to come across the book Mobile Methods from Larissa Hjort and Gerhard Gloggen, 2 media communication scholars that have been really in the mobile space for a long time. And it was really nice to see how they, to give a quote from their book, "Creative practice research is crucial for pushing the potential of mobile storytelling, a field bringing together filmmaking, new media artists, creative writing, to reflect critically on place and culture. This field of experimentation was created by Schleser and Rebellious," which is a book that I will mention later on. And I think for me, the interesting thing is like with my research, connecting to other colleagues and shaping the field with my colleagues. And so I think that's something that I would like to sort of talk a bit about when I talk about the networking. And then Thinking Through Digital Media by Hudson and Zimmerman. Schleser experiments with the formal and epistemological possibilities for documentary with small cameras, included on mobile devices intended for multiple purposes. And so, yeah, I think that still holds very much true, even 10 years later. And I think Patricia Zimmerman's and Helen de Michel's open space documentary, Toolkit for Theory and Practice, was a really great approach to think about projects that might not really have a space, or might not have like a form of analysis provided elsewhere. And in another book by Patricia Zimmerman, Documentary Across Platforms, she makes a case for small-scale, local, sustainable, modest, resourced, long time frame collaborative projects. And she very much thinks about this as very much an unresolved space. And so again, it's a great opportunity for creative art researchers to step into this space and think about the transformative capacities of storytelling and really thinking about this process, how we can shape stories. The open space documentary toolkit for theory and practice argues very much a shift away from the narrow focus on highly crafted finished product towards responsive and iterative process deployed across platforms and places. And Zimmerman and de Michel develop these C's: circulation, collaboration, community, complexity, compositing, connection, context, continuum, conversation, and cost, which resonates very well for me as a smartphone filmmaker. I think they have also like an outline of how they see these new media documentaries shaping, and they sort of very much argue we see there's a shift from director to convener and designer, from confrontation to collaboration, from characters to communities, from one to many, from augment to exploration, from story to stories, from incarnation to invitation, from fixed to permeable, from closure to open, from pushing out to pushing in, from expository argument to mosaic construction, from documentary triangle to a circular approach. And that was for me to think about how we define, or how we could define the mobile creative arts method, or something that I would like to term smart storytelling, or maybe just Max's method. And so I think cost, of course, because it should be accessible. I think simplicity and the access to the tools for storytelling is quite important. Stority, spontaneity, and support. Collaboration, connection, curiosity, creativity, conversation. And I will try to outline some of these through some of the projects in a second. I think also to sort of say that I did my PhD at the University of Westminster in the Cream Research Center. And so I very much trained as a practice-led researcher. And so that sort of presented the definition from at that time, the Arts and Humanities Research Board, which of course, systematizes this through research questions and problems, generating new knowledge and understanding through the form of film. And so there's been some really great resources of creative arts research, creative practice research. And I think, of course, most of them will really see process as one of the key elements. But of course, the idea of sharing and disseminating new knowledge is quite important. And I think that's where the networking element can really come in. In the screen production research, creative practice is a message of inquiry. In the introduction, Gibson outlines 13 key moments: curiosity, identity, check, declare, focus on the quest with questions, read, devise, declare your method, generate new knowledge using the method. This is iterative, creative, cumulative, and sometimes recursive, original, recursive, explicit, above, test your argument, knowledge transfer, start a new investigation. So just a very quick fire summary, really. But then, of course, great to see that Ross Gibson would also have a great Instagram page, for instance. So I quite like this approach, the quote that I was just reading out. And I think that's one of the key things for us as creative arts researchers. I always think it's quite important that we can really push the methods that are within our discipline rather than trying to borrow from other disciplines. I think that can then also distinguish us and where we can provide some innovation, and also interdisciplinary projects make some key contributions. So of course, a research question is key in this field, and I think it's always important to understand who our contemporaries are, but sometimes if there's maybe the process of outlining who are our contemporaries and researching how a particular field is shaping. And then a historical perspective can bring some really interesting approaches to it. So, like the way that I mentioned, I'm quite fascinated by Dziga Vertov. This practice that was established and of course was further developed through cinema verite approaches. You can then think about alternative filmmaking methods such as dogma filmmaking or digital filmmaking, and that is a way that some of these alternative waves can continue. And there's a certain trajectory that one can position one's practice in. And I think it's about finding the moments when there is films that have a certain similarity conceptually that one can develop further. So, which is a starting point for these academic conversations that we have. The frame of how to frame a research question is some tips here to say that I took from the role of the Artifacts and Framework for Practice-Based Researchers by Candy and Edmonds. And they sort of think about two sets of research questions. I think it's quite interesting to see that they really much use the practice as a starting point in the initial process. And then, of course, it works through systematic process that results in the new knowledge and understanding. And for them, there's the three elements of practice, theory, and evaluation. I've also recently come across Research, Practice, and Knowledge, introducing the Creative Knowledges Enabling Framework by Betty and Salihpour. I think it provides a nice overview of the position of our artifacts and ourselves as researchers. And they argue for research-enabled practice, so that the outcome of research embodying research findings in the materiality craft of the creative artifact, and very much the method or site of research from which knowledge about practice process are attained. And they've got a great quote, which is: the creative artifact is not only made possible through conducting underpinning research. Existing theories, ideas, practices, and so on are tested and expanded through creative application. The creative work is thus an outcome of the research, and through its materiality, DNA embodies the research findings. The creative artifact is a work that knows, a thinking work. The creative work contributes to the knowledge in and of itself. And so I think when I look at the Rebellious research talks, I think that the audience knows about creative practice research, so we don't need to explain in very detail using it for an audience that hasn't heard about this before. But I think there's also some really good opportunities to think about visual methodologies, how creative practice research can support qualitative or can work in synthesis with qualitative and quantitative research. And I think I quite like Claudia Mitchell's and Nangin De Lange and Williborn Molston's participatory visual methodologies, social change, community and policy. And I think just really briefly wanted to mention that some of the projects that I've been working on in interdisciplinary context with lots of colleagues, so from here, from Swinburne, from the Social Innovation Research Institute, for instance, or from Media and Communication, my contribution was really to help out what is a community voice. And I think that for me is also a rebellious act to support communities, that we can shape representations in the way that they would like to be seen. But to get back to the world of mobile and smartphone filmmaking, I think we could now make very much an argument that smartphone filmmaking, or it could be like a thesis to present, is like the new of DV filmmaking. So there's like young Max making a project in London. It's one of the last times I worked with a non-mobile camera, so to say. And the latest project that I was working on was a colleague in Dr. Kabil in Bangladesh, making a documentary, which is just being edited now. And it made me think about how now I was working with Dr. Kabil, who is a journalist, who's working more of a traditional approach to storytelling using two smartphones, or like a two-camera setup. And so I think it's really quite interesting to see how smartphone filmmaking is evolving in these different domains. And so for me, of course, I'm positioned in in Australia, you've got the field of research, so it would be 36, the creative arts of writing, or the subsection 3605, which is, screen and digital media. But I think lots of my work is really about how can we shape some of these fields. There's like another classification, which is 360599, screen and digital media not elsewhere classified. And I think there's some really great opportunities in understanding what happens in these spaces. So if you don't like my thesis about mini DV and smartphone filmmaking, maybe talk to Danny Boyle. Most of you will know he shot more or less the same time, 28 days later. And this year, 28 years later, was produced on an iPhone. So, yeah, but 28 days later was $8 million budget. 28 years later, $75 million budget, and they chose a smartphone to do this. So, for some very particular reasons. As you can see there in the still images, I'm not really sure if that is really still mobile filmmaking when you mount a big lens in front of a smartphone, but there you go. It's sort of maybe the punk moment of smartphone filmmaking where it's become mainstream. And so on one side, I'm like, yeah, I've always told you this would happen one day. So I'm quite excited about to see this. On the other side, what I'm really more interested in is some of the, what we could call alternative or specific mobile original creative practices. And in 2023, I was fortunate enough to work with the Sidelines Journal. I was the editorial board to create a special issue, and we had some really great contributions. And I think that's a field that really excites me, when different various filmmakers, creatives, artists, researchers, creative arts researchers very much present their original approaches. And of course, Sidelines is very nice. It presents the NTRO, the non-traditional research output, with a research statement, and then the peer review is also published for it. And so you can really see how mobile and smartphone filmmaking or mobile media provides there very much a space of its own in the field of screen and digital media. At the same time as for the introduction, we also produced a really great resource with my colleague Angela Blake from SF3, the Smartphone Flixfest in Sydney. And we curated sort of a best-of Mina and SF3, and it's part of the introduction. So a really great resource to have a good overview of mobile and smartphone films. And the way that I got into sort of creating smartphone film festivals was very much when I finished my PhD film, Maxus Kaitai. It took a while before I managed to get into some festivals, but at the same time I started to talk to some other, which I then found mobile filmmakers like Iran Kavanov or Matthew Noel Todd, and they very much told me the same story that, oh yeah, we've produced a work and people tell us it's good, or festivals tell us it's interesting, but we don't have a category for it. And so I was like, maybe we should just show these films. And so I think I can say that it was the first ever screening of mobile feature films, which happened in the Lumiere Cinema in London, so which was quite nice to see that the place where the Lumiere cinematograph was presented. In 2008, we then presented the first ever screening of mobile feature films. And I think that was really the moment where you could say, here you can identify some qualities of a mobile film in relation to another mobile film. It was quite a great event. Filmmakers like Peter Whitehead came, another filmmaker made a sort of documentary about the event, and it also ran at the same time with an exhibition in the London Gallery West. It was called Film Mobile, the event, which was part of the Node London network. And so then I moved to New Zealand, Aotearoa, and I started MINA. So it's Mobile Innovation Network and Association, with some colleagues in New Zealand, and it was really like in the film archive, a really great event for me, very important, not only to screen films, but also to have a discussion on what filmmakers and audiences think mobile smartphone filmmaking is and where this field is developing. And so I see it very much as a method to create connection, to celebrate stories, and to have a conversation about these new directions. And I think the great thing about mobile and smartphone filmmaking is that it's such a fast developing space. And so that is very much the same thing that happened last year. We have the screening at ACMI, the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, here in Melbourne. At the same time, then at the Mobile Studies Congress, we had an online panel, so where the smartphone filmmakers could meet. We were not part of the audience. It's been great to work with SiteVault, a film a platform. We launched MinaVault, which is sort of a decentralized way of showcasing the films. A bit of a trailer, but I might sort of skip that because you can find it online. Just keep an eye on time. The great thing I think for me is always to see the feedback by the smartphone filmmaking community, that there is really a great appreciation of bringing this together and having the screening very much by filmmakers for smartphone filmmakers. And so, if you look into creative arts research methodologies, of course, it's a reflective process. And when we try to think about networking as one of these moments for reflection, we find that some creative arts, creative practice research texts very much say that it's good to do networking. So from Candy, it's like the ongoing creative arts research advances research methodologies through developing, quote, supportive structures for new ventures, and it centers around the community building. And Agatha, to quote from your book again, it's about encouraging constructive feedback around building new innovative epistemologies, sorry, it's getting late here, and not being afraid of breaking the rules and being courageous and innovative in defining the new how. And so if you look at other fields, like in the fine arts, there's a relational aesthetics, and media and digital literacy, there's Howard Jenkins with affinity spaces. There's a Wagner, it's of a more business and marketing developed very much a community of practice. And at the Mobile Studies Congress, we invited Professor Susan Kerrigan to give a keynote, and she talked about the systems model of creativity in relation to mobile media, which is a really fantastic way to situate mobile media, but also to map out the field of mobile media itself. And so I thought, that's actually similar what I did in the book, sort of applying this idea of the systems model. And so in the book, Smartphone Filmmaking Theory and Practice, I not only talk about the filmmakers, but I also talk about the Smartphone Film Festival directors. And again, like lots of them are filmmakers themselves, because it seems to me that you need to understand this practice very well to create it. But I also wanted to emphasize that there is this very much ecology, this screen industry appearing. And so there's now apps, there is different companies that provide various tools for smartphone filmmakers. So that means there is a whole ecology that is evolving around this, which I think slightly differentiates from other independent or alternative filmmaking film forms. And so it's great. Susan Kerrigan is my colleague here at Swinburne, and so she's our department chair. Sometimes I need to ask her some of these questions about timetables and all these sort of things. But whenever I talk to her, she's like, "Oh, Max, I published a new book." And so recently she published Creativity in the Creative Industries in Regional Australia, Interconnected Networks, Shared Knowledge, and Choice-Making Agents. And the creative system in action, I think, is a very interesting approach to outline the interdependencies, interactions, and the interplays of social and cultural structures and systems. And I think it's very interesting then to map this onto what could happen in the smartphone filmmaking world. And also in the book, the authors, McIntyre, Kerrigan, Fulton, King, and Williams, talk about holarchies, so that systems that are operating above and below what is being observed. So it's not the idea of smaller systems that have systems in themselves. And so again, that is a mapping out of how smartphone filmmaking operates similar to the film industry, but it has its own specificity. So to give you one example, for instance, people wouldn't understand how big the change was when Filmic Pro was bought by another company and they changed from their one-time payment to subscription model, how upset the whole community was, and how that probably changed also the way that some people know using different tools for filmmaking. And so I think these are some very specific things that need some very specific mapping. I mean, if you study cultural production, of course, you know, back to Bourdieu, and I think it's very much, yeah, the argument can be replicated that it's an artistic field, and smartphone filmmaking, like Bourdieu was studying French literature, has its own specific laws. So to quote him, artistic field is defined by the fact that the more autonomous it is, the more completely it fulfills its own logic of a field. And so just a very brief overview of smartphone filmmaking. Last year, so we'll get some of the different smartphone filmmakers. But of course, it's not only about curating the festival, but it's also creating this whole ecology. So there is judges, there is supporters and sponsors that really shape what is happening in this domain. And so, big thank you to everyone who is continuing to support judging the MENA smartphone films. And the thing I think is, so these are the judges that were happy to have their pictures shown. At the Aspera conference, I was asked a question after a conference presentation about issues about diversity, and I think it's really great to see for me that some of the things that are not really working that well in the film industry, I think in mobile and smartphone filmmaking, in the MENA Film Festival, also in other festivals, I think it's a very diverse environment, it's very open, and it's very much about engaging, which means there's, you know, filmmakers and creatives from all various different backgrounds. The online screening platform MENA Vault also operates on a Web3 backend, so you can think about it as once your film is part of a screening program, it receives an NFT. And I think this idea of decentralization is really interesting. We haven't really pushed that full through. And so, for me, it is in the same way that filmmakers receive a laurel for a festival, you could now receive an NFT or like a blockchain address. So it's very much a digital authentication for your film. Someone controlling my slides. Not really sure what's going on here, but
I think we've lost your PowerPoint. It kind of flicked through till the end, so you might want to just reshare your screen.
Yes, I don't know how that works. Okay.
And don't worry, take more time. We have plenty of time, so you don't need to finish on like at a full time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stop sharing. Okay, so
yeah, we have it back. Yes. Yes,
Good.
wonderful.
So, no idea how that worked out, technology. So, I thought I would spend now the last couple of 20 minutes or so to talk about my own creative practice, and then highlighting some of the elements that I think are quite important in terms of like for the creative arts research process. So one of the films that I thought had some rebellious merit is Max Kaitai from 2008. I started filming it year before, and it was part of my PhD film. I went to Japan to make a city film about Japanese cities. And so, of course, at that time, working with a mobile camera phone in 3GP, pixels, images that, you know, were like tiny comparisons to what you could know with 2K or 4K or 6K on your smartphone. But for me, it was very much about working with the confinements and not trying to make a film look like a DV film, mini DV from my HDV film, but making it very specific to the mobile phone filmmaking. It's very much inspired by, Giga Vertus, the man with the movie camera. At the same time, also created a web blog, so a vblog, that time also kind of new. And that was very much for me outlining the documentation and the production process. So every third or fourth day, I would write a blog post and really much review the different approaches for the practice. The interval filmmaking method to work with movement in and beyond the frame really was the way that I conceptually edited the piece together. And the weblog was really also something that really saved, because I had around 180 hours of footage. So when I got back to London, that was a way to really capture this. But I think that idea of working with nowadays you get, three lenses, so to say, on your smartphone, but it's a fixed lens, so you can't change the f-stop. And I think that is something that still very much resonates, that when you work with a mobile phone or mobile device, you have to be always very close to the action. And so I think that is something that's very specific about mobile and smartphone filmmaking. You wouldn't put up your camera and then zoom into the action. You always have to be so close that you can touch it, particularly for the early camera phones. And so very much this experience of location and the notions of personal, immediate, and intimate qualities is what would make up something that I would call the Kaitai aesthetic. You can still find the film on YouTube. Even if you want to have a DVD, you could flick me an email and I could, give you a DVD if you like it. But there's also the entire feature film is on YouTube as well. As part of the process before I went to film in Japan, and Japan was really the idea, because at that time anything with mobile devices you would come across Japan. That's where the first camera phone emerged, and at that time it was really the place that seemed to be 3GP codes, QR codes were already in place. At the time when I went to Japan, it was the first MPEG-4 cameras, MPEG-4 video codecs on the mobile devices, so it was really fascinating to see. But before I started to film, I produced a film in London, which was just termed the mobile filmmaker, and it was very much a beta version, a proof of concept for me to understand how to work with these 3GP video files. So that were 176 times 1.4 pixels, which if you nowadays film with 4K Apple ProRes, it's like 3080/40 times 2160. So it's quite amazing to see how the space keeps developing. So it's also then for me part of a space where I think the practice will continue to develop. And one of the things that I think for me was personally quite important to have the film shown and at the Pocket Film Festival at the Forum des Images in Paris. That was a moment where I thought, okay, it can be all about smartphone filmmaking. So the Forum des Images is like ACME or BFI in London. You can still go to the in Les Halles, the Forum des Images, and see the film there in the Film Institute. And yeah, massive cinemas sold out. It was organized by Benoit Labaudret, who's also interviewed in the book Smartphone Filmmaking Theory and Practice. And it's really, I think, fantastic to see how even at that time in France, in 2010, there was a whole field of mobile filmmakers emerging. And so with some colleagues, Camille Baker and Kasia Molger, wrote up the article, The Aesthetics of Mobile Media Art. And for us, it was really much trying to see how our practices could be combined to really think about these specific mobile media art aesthetics, which emphasizes the location. The mobile device makes the mundane interesting, the everything confronted, providing a new lens for viewing the world through a new camera vision. The sense of intimate connectedness to the message, its subject and the author has emotional implications in everyday experience, making one feel special, important, inspired. And I think this idea of trying new production approaches and new filmmaking ideas was still very much resonated with me. So in 2013, the times of iPhone 5, I developed the Midtown, very experimental screen production, but it was filmed and it was edited while I was on Times Square. The music was made with a mobile app, and it used a mobile app to create some special effects like splice and time piles, and then the music was developed with iMachine, and it was then uploaded to the internet. So it never seen a computer in a way. And so again, this provides some new opportunities to make work in not taking the work into an editing lab, but to like almost work like an artist who paints on an easel in a landscape. And I think, yeah, thinking about some radical intervention is very much when I finally decided to make a vertical documentary last year in Kuching, sorry, 2 years ago in Kuching, Sarawak, Malaysia. And the idea of the vertical really emerged out of the practice when I filmed on location some of the community members. And through the vertical was the best way to portray them. And it was also a very easy way to navigate the space when you are, don't want to be intrusive in any way. And again, so it's very much in a similar way to working with 360 video production. It changed the idea of how you think about composition, camera angles, continuity, cutting, and close-ups. And so, so the 5 C's of cinematography in a very much in a different way. One of the other things that I very briefly need to mention as well is the idea of collaboration, which sort of ever been fascinated since I took part in the Pangea Day project in London in 2008, which was Nokia decided to make a film with different filmmakers in different cities. But of course, it was done through like the big Nokia company. But I think the idea of making a film with different other smartphone filmmakers was something that I found very fascinating. And so one of the things that I was very important ever since the idea of collaboration is for me to understand the moment of editing and how then decisions are made in the editing. And so what I really try to do is use mobile filmmaking and referencing documentary traditions and illustrate how these concepts can be applied to, in a way at that time, so in 2012, social media, and thinking about crowdsourcing strategies not only as a question of authorship, but also the examination of these works and the understanding of creativity. Collaborative mobile films shift from looking at a film as an end product towards examining the processes that can be revealed. The editing process could thus be understood as a negotiation or rather an open dialogue than a linear construct. And I developed with some colleagues 2 collaborative projects, so 24 frames and viewfinders. And it was really much an exploration of the reflexive process that allowed participants to engage in subjects of a choice that is relevant to them. And then through the creative involvement, collaborative filmmaking creates a sense of presence and sociability. The self-reflexive process is an indicator for the realization of audience engagement in these collaborative mobile phone films. And that exploration of tools and tech in different ways is very much what I saw with the early 360 cameras appearing. And it was also really great to see that you can edit or at least view timelines in Premiere Pro in a 360 project. And so I'm rushing a bit through time now, but I wrote up in the mobile cinematic VR, and where I try to really further develop some of the ideas of the Kaitai aesthetic to the field of mobile cinematic VR, which is focused on the notion of presence, the viewer as a performer in mobile cinematic VR, the intimacy and the independent art space for cinematic VR that create very much imaginative counters. And this was driven through a creative arts research project, which was called The New Dawn, so it's a cinematic VR project that explored an old derelict factory. And working with students, I think, is always really exciting to see how we can test new ideas of VR. And so for one unit experimental screen production, we always ask students to exhibit either in a TV studio or this is in a town hall gallery, which is just across the university at Swinburne. And it's thinking about experiencing work in different ways. So I set up like a mini Adobe Express page which lists some of the fantastic works from the students. The latest thing for me is to think about smart storytelling. It was really to try to think about what happens when I work with a LiDAR camera and when I work with generative AI. Of course, there's very different processes when you suddenly work with images that are rendered rather than video. And so for me, it was developing novel processes and thinking about how to deal with these computational videos. And so, of course, when working with Gen AI, there's a very much idea of prompt design, but when working with a LiDAR camera, it was working with touch designer, so it's very different from when you're working with video. And I think these sort of engagements are through creative experimentation, really. And then, of course, I think it's always quite important to analyze the films as well, using a similar digital approach or computational approach. So my last article, examining the emergence of the AI in its effect on the creative treatment, actuality, and computational fiction, talks more about this. And I recently came across Ji-Jun Kim's book, Defining Documentary's Expanded Fields. I think this is very much, a way where this talk fits in as well. And it sort of really tries to work with what he calls the rubric of 21st century documentary as a pluralizing concept that isolates a wide array of non-fiction media practice impacted by digital technologies and new platforms of exhibiting and experiencing moving images, such as 2D, 3D, digital imaging, digital image manipulation, mobile phones, cameras, without a human operator, the gallery, databases, VR, augmented reality interfaces, and the social media and video sharing services. Sorry, that was read very fast. The last thing I really want to say about being a rebel. Last year with the film students, we organized a talk supported by the Goethe Institute to invite Andreas Dresden, and he screens his film From Hilde with Love, which is about Hilde Koppy, who was like a resistance fighter, or resistance, a rebel, so to say, for the Red Orchestra. But I think the great thing about this film is she's not a big, she was an everyday person that stick to her values. And I think that was just, even in the darkest days of history, to stick to your values and to think about the things that, that one values. It was really great to see. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Max. I really cannot tell you how fascinating I found your talk. Really, there's so many. I have like piles of notes I was taking as you were speaking, and there's so many questions I'd like to ask you. So thank you so much. Really, really, really interesting. And yeah, I completely agree with you that your work is really rebellious in a sense of. And really fascinating how you get to the point where you identify, there's an opportunity to do something differently and just explore it and find ways to support others and create platforms and connections and networks. And it's just absolutely fascinating. Really loved it. So I'm going to take a privilege of being unmuted here, and just I'll ask you the first questions, and obviously I'm going to open it for everyone else who might be willing to ask questions. Perhaps you can stop sharing your screen so we can see, because we still see your desktop. Yeah, lovely, thank you. Oh God, so many. I don't know which one to ask really. I'm going to start perhaps with this idea of network as method, because this is something I really loved, and again, it's really proving how you think differently and creatively, because when a PhD student or someone who's starting their work asks you, okay, what kind of methods and methodologies I can use for them, they're just usually panicking and terrified, thinking about traditional ways of approaching things. And suddenly we can think, okay, well, you can actually think about something so very basic like collaborations and networking as a way of approaching your practice in that sense. So I wonder if you don't mind just saying a few words about that, like how you think about networking as a method, because I found it so on point and so fascinating, really.
So I think thank you, great question. I think the one thing when we do creative arts research, we need to know our peers. We sort of need to know what is happening in that particular moment in time, and where do we situate ourselves and our practice. What would be the dissemination of our practice? Where would this be seen? And so we're creating this position in the media ecosystem, in the screen arts ecosystem. But for some research, there might be no forum or no platform to present this, because just had the recent experience of creating a vertical video, and I was like, oh, vertical video is now quite old, but then I realized that lots of these vertical video festivals that I wrote about in the book Smartphone Filmmaking Theory and Practice don't exist anymore. And so, or not as many as there used to be. And so sometimes it's about, well, what do you do if there is not something existing that provides this platform that you have, but you find that there are other peers, practitioners that do something that is similar, and you see some trends developing. And so I think, you know, if you think about various different fields of, like, these days of immersive media, real-time filmmaking, just thinking about my PhD students, how they work with XR and community groups, there is some new fields that are emerging. And I think with a PhD project, if you do it for 3 years, if you can find some of these peers, you can not only talk about your own film, but you can then, or your own screen project or your own artifact, but you can talk this in relation to others that have similarities and differences. I mean, the other thing of networking is what you sort of prompted as find your allies, which are of course your supporters as well, and also maybe having some very focused discussions. And so I think that is the driving point for me, for instance, for MENA, for the Smartphone Film Festival, is that it's the highlight of the year for me. It doesn't matter how busy I am, it's the end of the semester, but you still do this before I do the graduate screening for film and TV. And it's this moment where I get these people together in one room that we want to have a discussion with some of the questions that I would like to ask, and curating this field for interactions provide some answers that I think you will have with certain people that are in the room that are these experts. And so it's about, what I try to do is sometimes like Bourdieu would study the field, but I think for us it can also be about shaping a field, which I think makes some really interesting contributions. And sometimes these fields might be overlooked, and if you are there all on yourself, you know, with your flag in the field, it might be difficult. But if you find that there is some colleagues that might do something similar, then I think you create some capacity around this. And so in New Zealand, Aotearoa, when I went through the first research assessment exercise, there was of the research submissions, there was also a contribution to the research environment. But it was just like a little side thing that had to be done, you know, and I thought actually, no, for me, if you're a mobile phone filmmaker or smartphone filmmaker, this becomes a key thing, because you want to shape this field that isn't there yet with your colleagues. And so the idea of collaboration, I think, is really something that supports to emphasize where you want to be with your project and your artifact. And I think the key thing then, what I try to do with the book, Smartphone Filmmaking Theory and Practice, is really to say, if you discuss such a form like mobile and smartphone filmmaking, you can only do it in comparison to other mobile and smartphone films.
Yeah, brilliant, fantastic answer. And again, like, really amazing job you're doing in terms of both listening to the community and trying to understand what's emerging them, and as you said, just providing platforms and kind of capacitating the field over there. Fantastic. So Carol, I know you have your hand up, so I'm just gonna pass it on to you.
It's a lovely continuation of that question, actually. This is not my field of expertise, I have to say, but in a past life, I was head of a contemporary arts department, which also had dance in it. And there was a really strong community of dance for small screen. And of course, suddenly space is really very interesting. How do you deal with space on a small screen and bodies moving on a small screen? So my question is rather, and you mentioned the different kind of communities, from 360-degree communities or vertical, but have you come across more disciplinary or practice-based different communities that deal with small screen, mediation of some kind or another? And what kind of communities are there?
Yeah, thank you. So when I started the MENA Smartphone Film Festival, I also was quite excited by the opportunities to create a conference around this, to have really like the idea of screening the films in the cinemas, the Film Archive, Tatanka Sound and Vision in Wellington. And then we organized a conference which is called the Mobile Innovation, Mobile Creativity Symposium. So the idea was then that the researchers could talk those who wanted to present and explain their films, or like provide further investigations, and that became also quite successful as its own. And then we ran it every year, so 2 years in Wellington, then 2 years at Auckland, at AUT University. So very much a colleague Laurent who helped out with this, or who like initiated this in Auckland. And then it was 1 year, it was at RMIT in Melbourne, and then it moved to Swinburne, and then I moved to Swinburne, and ever since then we started to organize conferences around this. And then at the conference at Swinburne in Melbourne, a colleague from China came, Professor Xu, and he's like, "Oh, I'm doing something similar in China. Shouldn't we like join forces and do this in China?" And so we had lots of meetings, lots of online conversations, and then at the Mobile Studies Congress was initiated. And that's now in its 5th edition. It's a very interdisciplinary forum where we bring together those who are really interested in mobile media, mobile communication, mobile creative arts. And so I think there's various different communities. Recently come across, like a few years ago, there's lots of researchers in mobility that are like very interested to like see what mobile filmmakers are doing, but they sort of approach it from a different field. And so I think it's really about finding where the intersections are between the different disciplines, and even in a very interdisciplinary context, I think supporting each other to develop and understand what everyone is doing from the different approaches. I mean, there's of course in the working with cinematic VR for me was very much a way to start working with immersive media, because it's a very different way to edit immersive media project. It's a very different way that you approach time. So like in a 360 video, like all your takes are suddenly 2 minutes. So for someone that had like lots of fast-paced editing, it changed the way that I edit. And so I think same with the verticals, like that sort of, which I think as a creative arts researcher, it makes you always think about the practice and then the work. I think was referring back to the idea of the research as a thinking object. And so I think which embodies that knowledge that you have then put into this investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where the dance team, this was at MMU. So they had an increasing community that engaged in, so what can dance be on the small screen? But the investigation, it's almost from a different trajectory. Whereas I guess you as a filmmaker come from the trajectory of filmmaking first, and then you use different technologies or tools or practices. And they, of course, came from the discipline of dancing first, but then understand what dancing in space, what bodies in space do, and how does it need to be adapted when you mediate it specifically through the small screen to maximize the dance potential through the small screen. So it was interdisciplinary, but the lines of inquiry were slightly different. And that's why it's quite intriguing to think, okay, so what does that mean? Especially as you mentioned the mobility impaired community, So it will be not just about the editing, it will be about the I guess the movement in space and what it means in relation to when you then get to edit it into a small screen mediation, or sort of a much more smaller viewing opportunity. I'm not a filmmaker.
I think it's I was very fortunate to here at Swinburne to work with Professor Kim Wind, who set up the Center for Transformative Media Technologies. And her work is really inspirational, how she works as a creative arts researcher and as a performer. And she has done some really great performance research that works with motion capture, that works with 3D, that works with immersive media. And we had the Smart Storytelling Day 2018. And she talked about embodied stories and how the connection of embodiment and Industry 4.0 context shaped what she termed Creative Arts 4.0. And that for me was like a really great way to think about smart storytelling as being part in this wave of using practices that are then extended or accelerated in different forms through
Nice.
these tools and technologies that provide creative interventions. So it was really like I think there's no here at Swinburne also another John McCormick who does some really great things with robots and performance. So I think the idea of movement is something that captures me definitely a lot.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Another thing I wanted to ask you, Max, is sorry, Gemma, go first. Lovely to see you here, by the way.
Yes, lovely to see you too. I'm really sorry. I was going to say I actually have to leave, but this has been super interesting, and thank you so much, Max. I've also been using my own phone for I'm trying to make a mini city symphony at the moment, so hearing kind of your allusion to that kind of thing was fascinating. And I'm sorry I don't have anything more formalized as a question, but I just wanted to say thank you before I have to disappear for a meeting. So thank you.
So, submit it to Mina, please.
Sorry?
Submit it to the Mina Smartphone Film Festival. Please.
I may well do. If I get it into my thesis first and get that submitted, then I will do my best. But yeah, thank you so much, and Agatha, hope to see you at BAFT. So
yes, definitely. See you, Gemma.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Let me just then ask the question quickly. So what I was someone is there. What I was about to ask you, what I found really fascinating, actually, it's two questions, maybe one comment and one question kind of combined. So what I really, really liked about, again, your talk and your work, obviously, is like how you almost start from, you said at one point when you were talking about your project, the first project in Japan, your PhD, how it was very much about limitation of, using mobile phone and a kind of low quality thing. But then at the same time, so you're really kind of exploring different aspects of mobile filmmaking in terms of storytelling, because it is about how it is more affordable, how it is more collaborative, how in some instances it's just more appropriate. And it was nice how you talked about one of your projects and made me think about my PhD when I was filming in Colombia with indigenous community as well. Initially, I wanted to bring the whole film crew, and obviously it was just a nonsensical idea, and then how I had to kind of scale it down. And it's just so it resonates with me so much, like in terms of not only rethinking the way of storytelling, but rethinking about the appropriateness of different storytelling situations, if you like, to your technologies. But at the same time, then you look into new technologies and exploring this idea of storytelling even further. So that really is absolutely fascinating. Now, the question I have is not really relating to this part, so I've kind of maybe two two things of it. But I don't know how about you, but I'm sure you will probably relate to that in some way. But my students very often feel like they just want to get the biggest, shiniest camera and just use all this piece of equipment out there, and very often they prioritize it before they think about storytelling. And obviously I'm trying to motivate them to think about the story first and then think about what kind of technology you use for this. So I wonder how these two trends happen in your job as as someone who also shapes new generations of filmmaker, and whether you ever have this kind of conversations with your students where they say, well, no, I want the biggest, shiniest, newest camera, and yet at the same time you're telling them all these fascinating ways of using mobile phones and just exploring different ways of storytelling. I'm sorry, it's a long question, but just being...
It's a great question. I think also really nice to hear the way that you've sort of prompted it with some of the work you've done before. I think to get back to the students, yes, I mean that's the experience that I can sort of think about with the unit experimental screen production, and it's at the moment in our first year. I think we're hopefully gonna move it to our third year soon, because we ask students to break stories, but they haven't really fully engaged in storytelling and made stories yet. But I think the thing that happens in that project, in this unit, is students sometimes have said I come to a film school, now I have to work with a smartphone, what's going on.
Exactly.
But my prompt is the key thing that we are trying to do here is we're trying to understand who you are as a filmmaker. What is your creative voice? So I found the Max style of making films now. So now I'm even developing the Max method for working with emerging media, and I'm trying to tell the students what is your style that separates you from everyone else. What is your superpower? What's your thing? And that we only find out through experimentation. And for students also understanding what your passion is. And so once they understand that this is very much a creative exercise for them, I think they sort of really get into a zone once they understand how experimentation supports them in becoming a filmmaker that can separate their own style from others. We are like on a way where these things become, where the filmmaking becomes really interesting. And of course, the other thing that I sort of really prompt to the students is like, well, if you can make a good film with a fixed f-stop on your phone, you can make this with a big camera too. And so the other thing, of course, that's thinking about the availability. Like if you got your smartphone with you, when your idea strikes, you can film it, and you can whatever time it is. If you're out in the middle of the night, you get up in the morning, whatever. If you see something, you can film it. And so I think it's very much an exploration, which can be all of these various different things. So you can think about it as a visual sketchbook, but I think it's sometimes very nice for students to show some of the films, documentaries, or feature films that have done very well. I mean, of course, Steven Soderbergh helps too. That he had like Unsane with big Hollywood budgets, or this is a Netflix series, very much with Sean Baker as well as this film that made all the major festivals. So there's some great examples where students understand how this provides a very particular way of filmmaking that you couldn't do with a bigger camera. But I think finding the student's voice is really what I think the most important thing is, and to be really creative and to understand how you can understand, the students can understand what they're really passionate about.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I completely agree with you. And also one of the things I wish we had more time, because we know we're running towards the end, and I didn't even open questions to anyone else. But one of the things which also resonated with me a lot is when you talk about how accessible the technology is, and we're talking about on a global scale, the distribution of or inequality of access to filmmaking really for many communities. And obviously mobile phones are much more accessible than big camera crews and things like that. And again, that opens up opportunity for so many people who would not be able to tell their stories to actually do it. And again, by providing platforms for people, and by doing this amazing work you're doing, it just becomes more acknowledged and understood and shared and networked, if you like. So that's really nice, which again makes me think about, as always, as we know, when mobile phones started getting better and better cameras, how many people would say, well, this is really bad, because now this division between professionals and everyone being a filmmaker blurs, as if it was a bad thing. But you, again, quite rebelliously and quite wonderfully, just saying, well, actually, that's a good thing, and we can make that work, and we can make it something of great value. So just really, yeah, fantastic thing. I don't know if you want to comment anything on the last bit. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you. It's really nice to hear, and very great how you frame it. I think there is of course, for the screen industry, we can make some great contributions as making documentaries, co-create documentaries with communities, or make narrative films. But I think now that digital literacies and visual methodologies become more and more important, I think it also becomes a really great research tool for interdisciplinary research projects, and I think it sort of helps to push methodologies even further. And so I think creative arts research can make some really great contributions to other research projects to find the community voice and to help people, communities shape representations about themselves they couldn't do before. We think so. If it's some all these discussions around social media and how this is so bad, or what the opportunities are. I think if you have the right literacies to understand how these things operate, I think that is the best way to engage, by having the knowledge about how to shape representations and stories and understandings about these tools. And so I think that is sort of two areas where I think that are very important. That yes, we make contributions to the screen industry, but I think now we make contributions beyond it. And I think for the screen industry, I'm trying to be so rebellious to say now that the smartphone will also influence the screen industry more broadly, so that we can see now, so that 28 years later was filmed on a mobile device, and that will sort of shape how maybe some other films look in the future. So the idea of screen life or stories, what happened to like vertical video, these sort of interventions sort of will become a trend that shapes the film industry. That's sort of my rebellious contribution here. But I mean, like, maybe in the same way to say that like short film emerged the handheld, it wasn't accepted before. Like suddenly, like, where don't you have it? And so I think as a rebels, we can sort of push these arguments, which we can define through our creative practice.
Oh, that's brilliant. And what a better way to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Max. It was absolutely fascinating. Really grateful for your time. I know it's late where you are, so we're going to wrap it up. Immensely grateful. I will upload the recording later today, so it will be your tomorrow. And just kind of to say thank you for everyone who joined. And our next seminar, which is going to happen next month, we're going to have Jimmy Hay, but more about it later. So have a lovely night. Thank you so much, and
Thanks
I'll
for having
definitely
me.
keep an eye on all your work ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Bye.